Hello and welcome to this presentation on storytelling with data for the Power Platform World Tour in London in August 2019. So this is the practice session I'm doing before the conference event, and it will make available on YouTube and social media for people who weren't able to attend the conference to view at their own leisure. So a little bit about me to start with. So my story is I'm a Power BI consultant, speaker, trainer, evangelist overall with this technology. I really am quite passionate about it. I've learned a lot from the community over the years, and I like to really try and give back as much as I can. The community is one of my main ways of learning and keeping up to date with this technical knowledge. I'm really grateful to kind of having communities and a lot of the MVPs and community leaders that I work with in the Power BI and data platform community. My background is actually not kind of from a BI data angle, but actually I'm a chartered accountant, come into Power BI through kind of Excel and VBA, and just really having a passion for it. And that's translated into learning the hard way and really understanding these concepts. And this is one of the main ways that I've got to where I have in this stage is by sharing that knowledge with other people. I'm really a firm believer of if you want to be able to learn something, you need to be able to teach it. So in terms of this session, what we're going to be looking at is why we want to consider storytelling, what we mean by storytelling, look at the types of data storytelling, and then how to build a data visualization using these ideas and using these principles. So let's start with kind of definition of the story. And this is kind of just the first thing that really came up when I put it into search engine on the internet around, what is a story? And really it's about getting across information. It's something that's quite innate to humans. Storytelling's been around for far, far longer than any records exist. It's everything is the way we communicate. And actually I've been reading this book called Sapiens, and it talks about how storytelling is the reason really that we rule the world rather than other animals. So it's really, it's getting across that information, it's that ability to be able to communicate. So in that regard, every report, every data visualization that we build is a story. But if we think about what makes a good story, then actually there has to be more to it than that. And actually, if you think about narratives in movies and books, there's always this idea of tension or conflict. Something goes wrong or something isn't quite the way that everything is normally, and actually it's through this tension and through the resolution of this tension and conflict that the story emerges, that you have heroes and villains and people who are on either side. So actually, this is where this thing about putting across an attitude or a point of view or an argument and having that tension is really what makes a good story. And I think, with data visualization, these principles do apply. The conflict is really your performance. The tension's your performance, whether that's good or bad or better or worse than expected. And the resolution of that tension and conflict is that story you tell through the data. And I think people are quite nervous about this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think a lot of people believe that the data should just speak for itself, right? Let people draw their own conclusions on what the data tells them, rather than the report's author, who may not be as close to the business as the consumers, to choosing what is important or pre-selecting information. And the other reason is that data might change on a regular basis. So we're building reports and dashboards in Power BI where data gets refreshed and actually that story might change. So it's quite difficult then to kind of get across a point of view or an argument about what the data is saying when that data might not be the same tomorrow. And those are valid concerns. But what I've kind of learned over the years is that to get really effective engagement, you need to highlight what is important of the data. You need to strip out that noise. And because you've done that analysis and because you've gathered those requirements from the audience as to what they need, you're best placed to be able to do that. And you have to get that across in your reports. So it isn't easy for the reasons I just said. But actually, that is the most important thing with data visualization, and that's why I see a lot of reports where they they look good, and they've got some good engagement with a very small group, but once they start to get rolled out to a wide audience, they don't have the kind of business engagement that they're hoped for. And that's generally because they don't tell the story in the right way. They're not engaging enough to be able to take people on that journey. And there are ways to get around those concerns, and I'll go through that, and hopefully by the end of the session you'll see some ways to do that. So why tell stories with data? So this is a lot of we've talked about that. It's really to drive that business engagement, right? So storytelling, this is the science behind it. Again, these are just kind of things that come up when you look at storytelling and the impact it has. So it taps into the emotional brain. People relate it to themselves, to their own stories, to their own worlds, and they immerse themselves in the story, which makes it more memorable and more impactful. And that's why, as I say, storytelling is so innate to us as humans, and it's why every form of communication, every form of media that we look at or consume tends to be storytelling. So in terms of the types of data stories, I'm going to relate this back to use an analogy here for academic subjects. So you take yourself back to when you were studying at university and you were looking at different ways of learning and presenting the information. So, for example, I did philosophy and economics at uni, and I had to study the texts of Aristotle and Kant, which made as much sense to me now as some of the data that I work with at the moment. So, quite obscure. And you start with taking notes to explore the subject. So you read the text and explore the notes. But at the end of the semester, you don't just make your notes look a bit pretty and then hand them in and say, here you go, this is what I've done. Because actually the examiners or the people assessing your knowledge of this won't be able to necessarily understand what you've done. So instead, you take that knowledge and in an exam, you write an essay. So you write a structured set of points and arguments to answer a specific exam question. And a good essay builds up that argument. You explain your points, you evaluate them, and you get across your point of view, demonstrating that you've really internalized the material. And then when you finish university and you get approached by a publisher to say we want to make this timeless philosophy knowledge accessible to children, then here again the essay won't really cut it. You need to distill that message into simple points with pictures, with clear narratives. And this has a real parallel with data visualization. So, as I say, the tension in your story is that performance be better or worse than expected. And in the terms of the types of reports that comes on, so with visualize, you start with taking notes as analogous to your own scratch pads, your own exploratory analysis of that data. So you connect to the data in Power BI, you bring it into a data model, you create some relationships and start just kind of seeing patterns or seeing what the data is telling you. The audience for this is really you. And then, that's probably the initial audience. But then primarily the reports you'll end up building will be for analysts or middle management who want to really understand what the data is telling them, to be taken on an exploratory journey. And then you might also have a more senior exec level audience who just want the insights. And you probably heard this before, execs are like children, short attention span. They need to have the message distilled enough to be digested quickly. They just want to know the recommendations and the actions they need to take. So you go from exploratory storytelling on the far left through to gradually more explanatory, being the most explanatory on the far right. And in this example I referenced in my blog from Storytelling with Data, doing the notes is opening up lots of different oysters to try and find which ones contain pearls, which ones contain those interesting insights. The essay is guiding the audience to those oysters which contain pearls. Because you've opened all those pearls, all those oysters, you know which ones contain the pearls, so you're guiding the users towards the one which contain the pearls. And then the children's storybook is just giving them the pearls. So, how this, I'm going to continue this analogy because I think it can go quite far and still hold true. And in this analogy as well, one of the best pieces of exam advice that I've ever received is to always bear in mind that markers have hundreds of exams to mark potentially in a very short space of time. As a result, they're very busy and they're very lazy. So if you want to do well in the exam, you have to make it as easy as possible for them to give you the marks. They're not going to spend the time and really try and analyze whether they think, you were trying to get this point across or whether actually this was really an evaluation. You have to make it crystal clear and obvious, make it so easy for them to be able to just tick off your essay against the marking criteria. So the idea behind this is to reduce cognitive load. And it's exactly the same with data visualization. You have to know what the assessment grid is, which is essentially points 1 and 2 here. And then points 3 to 7 are all about this reducing cognitive load. So starting with the first point around what you're being marked against. And many data visualizations that I see, including many that I've built myself, fall short here. So lots show some potentially quite interesting information. So they show, this is how many widgets we showed last month. This is a breakdown by region. This is a breakdown over time. Okay, great. But what does that actually tell you? Can I look at this report and tell me if my performance is good or bad? In most cases, actually, that's quite hard to do because there's no real context for it. It just says we sold 200 widgets and, Europe sold the most. Okay, Europe's our biggest region. Is that better than we expected it to sell or worse? There's no tension there without that context. So, the 4 things you need to look for, and I've kind of seen this in a presentation. I've taken this from a presentation, by Zebra BI, Andrej, looking at kind of those 4 key things you need to look at any report. Is my performance good or bad? How good or bad is it? Why is it good or bad? And what can I do about it? As I said, if you apply that criteria to most reports you look at, most of them will fall short. There'll only be that small sample, a very small sample, which are really the kind of AA star deserving reports which answer all these 4 questions. And the reason for that is because it takes a lot of planning and thinking to get to this. And tying that back into the analogy with the exam grid, it's really, making those points in terms of what are you being assessed against is, do they make a point? Do they explain it? Do they evaluate it? And that's kind of what an exam assessment grid looks like. Next one is, does it need to look good? So is it, in line with corporate branding? Does it have a nice design? Does it have a grid layout? Does it have something that looks good and is easy to use? But also UX is actually much more about design. And that's, again, something I've realized a lot more, especially in more recent times. UX isn't just about design and looking good. It's also about usability. It's about performance. It's about how quickly do the visuals load. It's about ease of use. Is there navigation, like their buttons or their tooltips? Is it intuitive? And, you can't assume that everyone knows how to use Power BI. So actually, do the reports help to guide users on that journey? Do they indicate where there's things they can drill down into more detail or where they can go to see breakdowns? So the next one is around kind of know your audience. And again, I think a lot of reports potentially fall short here because they try to be all things to all people. They appeal to the analysts as well as high-level management. But they all have different needs and they want different things from the report. So some of you will have seen this kind of thing before that I've done. I do this in all of my community exams I have for quite some time. It's a standard kind of scoping template that I've put together to try and capture the high-level questions that a report needs to answer. So the first thing it needs to do, though, is pick specific people, ideally, named people. And then look at what those people are specifically interested in. So go and speak to them. Ask them the questions about what they do, not what charts they want to see on the data visualization. That's taking yourself down rabbit holes, which you don't really want to do, especially early on. It's more about those conversations with these stakeholders or understanding what their needs are, what they're going to do with that information, why they wanted data visualization in the first place. So you look at the problem statement, the questions they want answering, what those things that are keeping them up at night. You then look at and then, you can do some analysis of what the KPIs and measures are that would help to answer those questions, that would answer what are those measures. And then you look at what you want to slice and dice those by, what viewer filter them by, and as a high level, kind of what kind of data you need to be able to do that. So as here we've already we're focusing on the questions, we're focusing on the non-technical aspect of all this, but we're really looking at actually how we might need to design a data model and tell a story around this to be able to answer those questions. So the example I've shown on here is actually kind of a real life example that I had with one of my clients, which was looking at construction. So I can show the data source behind this, but essentially it was it's consisted of, on the first column we just had work package number, so it's essentially blocks of work that had equipment tied to it, and then a whole series of dates going through each stage of the procurement process. So everything from documents designed, documents submitted, to RFI, request for information, to going out to tender, doing a technical commercial evaluation, to right at the end issuing a purchase order. And each date had a planned date that we plan to do that stage and an actual date when it's been completed. And then at the end we had two dates. One was ETA, which was the expected time that it's expected to arrive on site, and then the ROS, which is a fixed date, generally fixed when it's required on site. So those are the two that kind of end fields, if you like. So when I started with this analysis, I kind of did some exploratory notes analysis, put it into Power BI, and there were lots and lots of things I could have done here. Right, looked at all the different times between each stage, the bottlenecks, where they're particular bottlenecks, how long particular stages take from particular areas of construction, all of these kind of things. But there's a lot of information to potentially show, a lot of it's all potentially interesting. But what I had to do then is take a step back and really talk to the stakeholders about what they wanted to see. And when I had those conversations, what I found out that they're really interested in is not so much all the how long each stage takes, but really those last two fields, that ETA and ROS, and actually the difference between those, the delay, or what they call the float. The point was actually there's some work packages which they know are delayed, and they've been delayed for some time, and yes, they're interested in seeing that delay and how many they've got, more than a month delayed or delayed by a couple of weeks. But what they're really interested in, what they don't really have visibility on today, was looking at actually which work packages have now become delayed. So last month was showing as they were going to be delivered on time, and now are showing as they're going to be delivered late. Because these are ones which they could potentially do something about now and need to do something about now before that delay worsens, or to really understand what's changed since that last period. And by doing that kind of analysis, so here we can see that come through, how many work packages are delayed compared to the previous month, but also which work packages have become delayed within the last month and which stage they've become delayed at. So now with this information, they've got something they could do something about. So we've really got to the core of what they need to know. And then actually the rest of that information we can put on a different report, maybe for a different audience, or essentially it's noise if it doesn't answer these specific questions. So now we've got a real focus for what we want to answer. And that's the key point around the storytelling. So from that scoping template, we can start to do what is called storyboarding. So we get some post-it notes and we jot down ideas of things that can answer those questions. So we might have some KPIs, measures, and things to view and filter them by. We jot down some ideas, not necessarily what graph type it is, that's not necessarily important, but more just kind of we want to show this versus this, we want to show this over time, or this metric. And these might be the titles for your graphs essentially, but we're just brainstorming, and we're brainstorming on post-it notes, so it's fluid and it's done in a workshop environment with stakeholders. And we try to get a mix of pure statements, so we sold 200 widgets last month, and arguments, which are statements with context. We want to make sure we get some of those arguments in there, that we really say we sold X% better or worse compared to the previous same time last year, or something that gives that context as well. And a lot of people, I think, try and do this thing just with Power BI because actually it's so easy to produce graphs in Power BI, so they come up with lots of different examples and show them. And whilst that works in a way, it's actually still much better just to do it on post-it notes, because there's still much less emotional attachment to it. It's still much easier to do. It's still much more accessible. And you're not using technology at this point. It's a much better thing to do, especially kind of in a workshop environment. So this procurement example, this is the kind of some of the post-it notes I did for some of this, and you can't really probably read this very well, but there's a mix at the top which has kind of statements, so the number of work packages in total, and then arguments, so the number of work packages delayed, the latest and in the prior month. So now we're giving that context. So the prior month is giving context. We've got more work packages delayed now than we had last month, or less than we had last month. We've also got then some details and breakdowns, so things like showing it by time category, showing it by stage. And then we've got detail at the bottom where we've got a table of all of those work packages. And the idea is, this is, we started off with maybe 50 post-it notes and really distilled it down to these, the core ones that take users on that journey. So start with that high level journey and allow people to drill into that detail. And this is kind of the end example. Obviously, this is anonymized. I've put it under a different brand. So here we're using, we start with kind of the high level metrics, number of packages, number delayed last month, delayed prior month, now delayed. And then we've got the value of those work packages now delayed and the total delay. So we've got some kind of key high level metrics here. And then we've got some details as to those work packages that are now delayed, the packages that are by last completed stage, and then those ones that are delayed by delay time category and last completed stage. And then we can use those to filter the table. And we've got a table here with all the work packages with that float, that difference between the ETA and the raw state. So we've got some kind of, what's important here is now we've represented that story through the storyboard. And one of the things that also helps with this idea of storyboarding is to think of this thing called the big idea. So this is a kind of single sentence that gets across an elevator pitch for your story. So it's really like if you had, just a couple of minutes to explain to someone what your data visualization is going to be about, what you're going to tell them. It's telling them this is what you're going to see. And you can see here it's, whilst these numbers will change. So I've said X work packages worth Y million are now delayed compared to Z the previous period. These numbers will obviously change month on month each time the data is refreshed. But the story doesn't change. Actually, and this is not in itself saying whether it's good or bad, but we're getting across that idea, we're getting across that context because we're giving a comparison. So actually, we've got all the context here, we've got all that story, but this is the way that we're able to deal with the fact that actually it might be what it tells you might be different next month, or next period, or next time it's refreshed, but we still get to keep that common thread of what we're trying to get across. And this has really come from that ruthless prioritization of those statements, of those things that you want to show. We just have the minimum we need there to get across this big idea. Just to focus on a little bit more around this idea of arguments and picking your arguments. So, as I say, the difference between statements and arguments is that statements are just kind of numbers or values, and arguments are those statements or those numbers with context. Now, a lot of this comes down to your visuals that you choose. And 80% of them, in all honesty, should be bars and line graphs because they're easy to understand and they get across a certain level of detail. They show a trend over time and they show a breakdown. And people get that and that's good for a lot of visualizations. But by themselves, they don't show context. So you've got a couple of options there. Either you can modify some of these graphs, so bars and line charts. You can modify, put reference lines in there. You can to try and show previous values or trends or averages, and you can also then show increase the bars, the width of particular lines, for example, in order to kind of bring out that context. You can show different lines, so plan versus an actual line, for example. But also, what you can start to do is look at other visualizations which are very good at getting across that context. And to me, this is one of the main reasons to consider using a custom visual to go beyond those kind of bars and line charts as kind of standard, or to start thinking about using other types of visuals, not even necessarily custom ones. So these are some of the main ones that I use. I've borrowed a lot of these examples from SQL Jason. Jason Thomas, he works at Microsoft in the US. If you just put him into a search engine and type in visual vocabulary, it will come up with all these different types of graphs. So, distribution, showing part to whole, and then the types of graph you can use to show each of those. So I've picked out a few examples here that I think show context quite well. So first one we've got is kind of looking at KPI cards. So there are KPI cards in Power BI, and they do show context. They show trends over time and a change since the last period. I've done here is just showed a standard card visual, but added arrows and previous values to be able to provide that context myself. We've also then got a bullet chart, which is essentially a bar chart, but with a reference line in it. So the vertical black line there is your reference. It might be prior period or a target. So now we can see, yes, technology was the highest, and it was over budget. Furniture was also quite high, but it was actually under the target or budget value. So, now we start to understand that a little bit more just with the same visual. Waterfall charts, very popular for things like finance. Finance people love it. It's really showing what attributes contribute to a change in a value between 2 points, between points in time, or between two particular values. And which are positive contribution, which are negative contribution. So it's really, really good for being able to show that distribution, but in context of a value being higher or lower. And you've also then got scatter plots, and scatter plots automatically provide context because it shows two measures, one against the other, and therefore one measure is automatically the context for the other. We've got heat maps and KPI tables, and these are like tables, but they have color, for example, to be able to provide that context, so shading, and also potentially spark lines and KPIs within there as well to be able to, again, just show the data in a tabular format, which is absolutely fine, but bring some of that context. Line and column is to be able to then show metrics as the context for, say, a growth value or a percentage value or something else that's actually on a different scale to your ordinary values, and you can show those potentially as a line, but be careful with this because it can be quite confusing having the secondary axes. And slopes are like line graphs, but only show 2 points at the start and the end. So then what you're really focusing on is kind of just what that movement is, and comparing that across categories. So, and you can also use things like key influences visual. So, letting the AI do the hard work for you, says here. So here, this is a new kind of custom visual, the standard Microsoft visual, which is that GA. And actually it's quite powerful. You pass in a measure, and it will give you look at all the things that could possibly influence that, and it will give you which factors contribute to that particular measure being high or low, or being within a particular value range. Next, what we want to do is really think about the user journey, and we've done that a lot already by thinking about storyboarding, by thinking about the big idea. And starting with that high level detail and drilling down, and this is really what we want to make sure we get across with this point. So the 5 whys is a root cause analysis technique that's used in Lean and Six Sigma for identifying the root cause of problems. It's also used by kids across the world when they keep asking why. Every time you answer them, and even when you provide an answer, they'll ask why and why until they get down to a level of detail that they want, or until they get bored. So the idea is that you start with a high level problem statement, and you keep asking why until you identify what the cause of that is. So in this case, the problem statement might be performance is good or bad, or better or worse than expected, and again that could change, but we have a high level problem statement, and then we go down into being able to ask why until we can figure out why that's performance is good or bad, and essentially what we can do about it to get down to something that's an actionable cause. So this is what we allow. This is where we start with potentially a high level view, and then allow people to see those breakdowns, the drill downs, to drill down into detail. So we're not selling more, then we can show a breakdown by region or by store and see which stores, which regions are contributing to that change, and again providing context for that. We can then look at in an individual store, look at their employees, look at their products range, see if there's particular products that weren't selling well or particular employees that weren't selling enough, and then we can go in and kind of drill down whether it's particular employee performance, whether it's particular product performance, and why the reasons for that might be. And there's all sorts of things we can do to kind of aid this user journey. So obviously we've got chart interactions, so we select one element of the graph and it filters the rest. We've also got drill through, drill down, so drill through to another page, drill down within a graph. Things like report tooltips that provide that breakdown category when you hover over something. And things like being dynamic, so showing the same chart but having different measures on there. So a disconnected table that allows users to choose different measures or even dimensions, and then those show as acquired on the graph. Next, we're looking at number 6. We're looking at kind of keeping it simple, and we've probably seen this. Again, a lot of you will be familiar with some of the ideas in here, but it's all about getting rid of that clutter and that noise, and stripping things down to basics, and not using flashy images and lots of colors for the sake of it, and not taking your audience's attention away from the data. So, this is again just a generic example from the internet, but there's lots of examples out there. Thankfully, you can't do 3D in Power BI, so this is a bit of an exaggerated example, but it really gets the idea across. Actually, not having a coloured background, not having lots of different colours in there, and actually making things stand out a little bit more, not having grid lines for the sake of it. And actually, this could probably be cut down and improved a little bit more. What we need to think about then is also where we show things like data labels and axes. So, for example, you don't typically need to show both an axes and data labels. You show data labels if you're interested in particular precision, if you're interested in particular points, and if you're not, if you just want to show a trend, then you just have an axis. The data labels are not that important. If people really want to see the details of the numbers, they can hover over it, but they get the idea of the trend just from the axes or from the graph. So, things like Power BI, you can also change that label density. So it can make it look less cluttered if you kind of reduce that label density and have fewer data labels on your graphs. And then lastly, we're looking at kind of guiding attention. So again, we've done that a lot through some of the earlier points, through points 3 to 6 really, where we've looked at kind of storyboarding, looked at drilling down, getting that user journey, and being able to guide attention in that way. But there's a few particular things I want to bring out in this point. So let's start this with a little game. So we've got a grid here of numbers, and the exercise is to be able to count the threes. So start now, and when you've got an answer, just jot it down. And just give you a few seconds to be able to do that. Okay, hopefully most people have kind of gone through this and they might have doubted their answer, but hopefully everyone's got an answer. The idea here is, it's not whether you've got the answer right or wrong. It's actually, I think it's 13. I can't actually remember top of my head, but it's about kind of how long it took you to do that, how long it took you to scan through and find those numbers. So let's try again. Now count the threes. And hopefully that will have been a fair bit quicker, because all the threes there are numbered the same. They're all numbered in this orange colour, so once your brain has recognised that pattern, it can spot them a lot quicker and be able to count those. But there's still a fair bit of noise, and you can probably see where I'm going with this next. Let's try it the third time. Now we got the threes. And pretty much straight away, you would have got that as 10. You've seen that there were 10 threes and they kind of really stand out for you. And this is exactly the same with kind of data visualization. We're using that color as contrast, and that's where color is able to really guide attention. It's called one of the kind of pre-attentive attributes. So hopefully that gets across the idea that actually color can be a really useful way to guide attention when used in the right way. So not having rainbow colored graphs with lots of different categories, not having everything look the same, but actually just using color to focus attention to pick out particular data points. Suppose next then we want to see kind of which numbers occurred most often. So we can put that in a graph and put it in a pie chart. Could we tell from this pie chart? No, probably not. It's quite hard, especially because a lot of the pies look like a very similar size. Yes, data labels will probably help on there, but actually then because with the graph by itself doesn't tell us anything. What about tree maps? So people use tree maps alternative to pies to give it a bit of variety and get across the same distribution, but it suffers from many of the same problems. Still quite hard to see, especially when the boxes here are of a similar size. We can try with lines, and lines is a bit better. We have to look through it maybe a couple of times. We can kind of see then 3 and 9 look like they're the longest, and it's much easier for the human brain to decode length into a data point than it is to compare slice of a pie. And here we've made it a bit easier by aligning them all to the left, so they've all now got a common baseline. And again, now the top one and the bottom, the one third up and the top one. So we have to then cross-reference the legend. We can see that is number 9 and 3. Although those greys make it a little bit difficult to be able to take. That takes a bit of cognitive load to be able to get there. Less cognitive load here. You've got all the same color, and we've got data labels, so they kind of stand out a little bit more. But it's not really sorted. So again, we have to kind of read through everything and remember the values, and then just work out which ones are the best. And then obviously with our real example, it's now sorted, and we've used color to be able to highlight those highest values. So number 3 and 9 occurred most frequently. So these are called pre-attentive attributes. So these are kind of the main groups of them. So these are ways of guiding attention, of making things stand out. So length and width, those are often fairly inherent to the types of charts you use, although, as was mentioned before, you do have control over elements of this. So for example, you could choose the width of lines, or you could make things stand out more. Orientation, whether it's vertical or horizontal. Spatial grouping, so for example, if you're looking at a scatter plot, then that spatial grouping, all those points that are clustered closely together, people perceive as being similar in some way, which they are because those two measures have similar values, at least relative to each other. Size, so if you're using bubble charts or map charts, then you can potentially use the size of those bubbles to be able to indicate data points that have a higher value. And color, kind of what we've looked at. So color is probably one of the most important pre-attentive attributes, and also one of the hardest because it comes with the most of constraints. We have to use corporate branding. We have to be careful about accessibility, so color blindness, for example, and also look at how colors being used in graphs and use it sparingly. And actually, these constraints, whilst they could seem annoying, they're actually quite good because they force you to have to really think about things. And actually, the advice for color really is to make everything grey and then color items specifically which you want to show. And use things like gradients. So use red to green, or a different RAGS data scale to be able to show values progressively from high to low. And also make sure you use color consistently. If you're using colors for categories, then make sure if a category is represented in purple in one graph, it's also purple in the next graph, because people make those associations. So hopefully that gives you some ideas to really think about with this, and I want to go now and show a few demos, and I actually want to show some examples of stuff that I've built. Not because mine are the best examples out there. There's plenty of great examples around storytelling, but because I want to show you how I've built some of these things, or some of the things we've had to do in Power BI to be able to achieve some of this context and some of this storytelling. So we start with the procurement example that I showed in the presentation. So here then we're looking at work packages which is delayed by category. So we've got decrease in float. So this is the difference between that data is acquired on site and the data is now expected compared to the previous period. So 1 to 3 month decrease, which is bad, 0 to 1 month decrease, and so on. And it's kind of coloured according to that. And as I say, these graphs interact and they tell the story, and they allow people to drill into detail to say, I want to focus on those two and see the details of those two, or focus on one that's actually at that stage, and then drill down and see the details of it. So we've got that user journey. But also, I wanted to show a little bit about how you potentially get to some of these. So there is functionality in Power BI to be able to do grouping and binning, but what I've done here is actually created my own custom categories. So I've got some lookup tables here, and I've got one called float time categories, which is just a disconnected table, and it has start number of days, end number of days, and we kind of need to do an exact match or lookup like we do in Excel to be able to return, given a number of days, to work out which category it is returned in. Now, the challenge is we can't do a relationship between this table because there aren't particular data points. There might be, but it wouldn't capture all of them between this and our data. So what I've done with this is created a calculated column to essentially have a relationship in there. So in the procurement data, we've got then the float variance time categories where it filters that table for where the value is within the start days and within the end days. So within this, between the start date and the end days, start days value and end days value, and it returns the corresponding category. So it's like creating a virtual relationship on the fly. Now, with very large data volumes, this could have a performance impact, so it is something you need to be careful of. But it's something I found to be a slightly better way of doing grouping and binning than the kind of the standard binning that comes out using the standard functionality. So next, wanted to show this example that I did with one of my colleagues in Altius for the London Pug last year, so actually a year and a half ago now nearly. Time does fly. So here this was looking at kind of New York Times books, bestsellers lists, and seeing which books were kind of on number one. We started with contents page, and this is the scoping template. So again, as I say, I've done this in a lot of my examples and really kind of shown those questions, and included it in reports because it gives an idea then for people to be able to know what they're looking at. Which questions is this report trying to answer? And hopefully it's the same kind of questions that they had in their minds when they were coming into this report. We've got it broken down there for different categories, different pages, sorry. Then we've got the number ones, so we're showing things over time. So again, even though here we're showing just distribution, so the number of authors at number one by genre. So even though we've got a number of books at number one by genre and number of one-hit wonders by genre. So even though we're showing genre across all three, because we're showing a different measure, each of these is giving a little bit of context to it. So we're saying thriller is has had the most number of authors at number one and the most number of books at number one, but it hasn't had the most number of one-hit wonders. That's kind of mystery genre. So it gives us that bit of context for genre. This is the again custom visual. So again, rather just showing a line chart of the number ones, we're highlighting specific points using in each year, then kind of which one has the number by number of consecutive weeks. So we can see here actually that we can hover over it, so it pauses at each point, and we can see Love Story was at 41 consecutive weeks, so this was the highest one. And then we've also got breakdowns again on here and drill down functionality. So we could drill down into a particular genre and then see it by author, see it by book, and then we've got that same drill down on all of those. So this is quite interesting. What I really wanted to show actually was this genre analysis, and it's a way to be able to drill down from here or go into here and select a particular genre. The idea here, this is kind of a drill through page or a page focused on looking at one specific genre. So we've got lots of different genres here, and we wanted to show the number of books at number 1 for those genres and the number of authors at number 1. So typically we'd have two ways of doing this. We can just pick a particular genre and just show as a line graph the number of books by year, number of books at number 1 in each year. Again, that's useful to know, and you can kind of see whether the trend is going up or down, but it doesn't really give you much context because, well, okay, yes, we can see that it's got more number 1s now than it did in the past, but is that the same with other genres as well? We have to click through each individual one and kind of remember the data points and then try and compare them. So to have that context, we could have plotted all the genres. But then actually that would be a bit messy, especially with this many. If we tried to plot all of those on a single graph, the graph would have looked way too cluttered, way too much noise. We wouldn't have been able to understand anything. So what I've done here is actually shown the selected genre, so whichever one we've got selected here in blue, and then the average of all other genres in grey as kind of that context line. So again, we're drawing attention to the selected genre, but we're providing it context to see the average of all other genres. So we've got that way of showing everything, but in a way that makes sense. And just to show you how I've done that, so the measures that we've got on that were number of books at number 1, other genres average. See what that looks like. And we can see here it's using average X in the DAX formula. So filtering for all genres which are not the selected genre, and then doing a measure on that. So average X on that measure. So the first argument of average X is the table, and that table is of all the other genres. And then looking at those number of books by numbers 1. Because genres a dimension table, it has one row per dimension. So this is doing it for dimension by dimension, and then taking value by value, and then taking the average of all of those for that particular measure. So next I wanted to kind of show a finance example. So this is something I did recently. I started a kind of user group community, if you like, around finance with Power Platform. And one of the things I did with this is do a run through of an example with finance data and showing how to present it in Power BI. So what I started with is building up something that might be kind of some of what looks like a notes. So it's fairly exploratory analysis. We've modeled the data. We've got finance data in a nice star schema with a date table and our various dimension tables with accounts and account hierarchy. And we could produce a kind of pivot table style matrix that allows us to drill down into each line and produce an income statement. And already this is probably a little bit more powerful than what you can do in Excel, just because you can start to look at things like year and month and drill into that detail. But what we ended up with was an example that has a lot more storytelling, a lot more context. So here then we start off with some high level metrics that show the key values of the income statement, and again with context. Has it gone up or down compared to the prior year? So we started to really then see what those values are. And now we're looking at this for everything here is showing month to date, but we could also look at it quarter to date and year to date. We could then see the same kind of income statement that we had here, and we can see it in different ways. So we can see it as a drill down figure, we can see it as a kind of fixed format, and then we can see it broken down by region. And then on here we've got a waterfall that shows from the start of the month, so from start of May, so the previous month, to the end of the month, to the end of May. What was the value for by default for net profit, and then what was the value at the end of the month. And the idea is that what we've also thought about here is actually how this stuff interacts. So if we start clicking on a particular, let's say this is showing for the actuals, the net income, but if we look at cost of sales or net sales, for example, then this updates revenue. this then updates to show revenue. So the revenue at the start of the month, the revenue at the end of the month, and which specific regions have contributed to it. Obviously, because we're looking at this month to date, if we change this to quarter to date, now this updates to be the start of the quarter and the end of the quarter, and then these actuals, budget variances are all now quarterly values. And if we show it year to date, everything else updates. So these are now yearly figures, and then we've got from the start of the year to May. So for those 5 months, which regions have contributed to an increase, the overall increase or decrease in profit, or in any of the lines that we select there. We've also then go into a little bit more detail, provide again some of that more context for our data. So here we have focusing on particular sets of ratios. So again, we've got this idea of kind of dynamic measures. So we can look at a particular measure. So here we can look at cost income ratio, and we can see what it is this year, or this month, this quarter, compared to the previous period, and what that delta is. Or same period last year, and what that delta is. And then we can see a breakdown by region, but we've also got that prior year value as context. So again, we can see Europe has the highest cost income ratio, but how does that compare to, what's that change been? So actually, it's managed to, the cost income ratio has decreased over time in Europe. Or we can see that kind of breakdown with there. We've then got scatter plots to show at a level down below from region, where we can actually look at individual countries or divisions. So now we can start to see some detailed points and start to see outliers. And also interacts quite well with this. So we want to click on European operations, and we can see then actually cost income ratio current year and in comparison to revenue. Because again, it might be that actually it has a very small, very high cost income ratio, i.e. it's got a lot of cost relative to its income. But if its income is very low anyway, then it's not going to impact your overall cost income ratio very much. So here we're using revenue as that context. So we're using the scatter plot to be able to highlight the cost income ratio in relation to its revenue. So the things we can see here with a high cost income ratio and a high revenue are the ones that are really driving those numbers. Let's switch it back to month to date. We'll see actually, we can start to see that breakdown, say, between France and Germany, and see actually what that looks like. We've also then got that over time, so we can then see whether a particular months where it was high or low, and again compared to last year, and a breakdown by all of these. And these start to become quite interactive, so we can start to control click and highlight, okay, I want to see why my cost income ratio is so high in Europe, especially compared to last year. Look at, focus on France in particular. And then we can see, particular months where that was high, and then drill down and see what's driving those, so which particular lines are driving it. And now this is, once we click on, say, revenue, or we click on other income and expenses, everything else then filters now for us to show that particular data point. So we really got that as a kind of storytelling. Again, this is the kind of guided exploration. So we're able to, we've got a story behind all of this. We're saying, your cost income ratio in month X was this compared to, or year X or quarter X was this compared to this the previous period. This is how it breaks down by region. This is how it breaks down over time. These are the details. So you've got that kind of story, but it's an exploratory story. It's a journey which you're taking the users through. What we've also done, though, is then actually say, well, actually, how would we turn this into the children's storybook version? And this is where bookmarks really come into play. Because what we could do is, once we've done this exploratory analysis and we've produced the reports for those analysts, we could build the exec version, which has annotated graphs to really show that story. So we could then start to highlight particular points and say the cost income ratio for this month was much higher. We could then tell the next part of the story to say this ratio was higher in France and Germany, that Germany's revenue was higher overall, and we're highlighting again specific points with this. And we can say with Germany the ratio generally is lower this year, so we've taken particular graphs of interest, make sure we've highlighted the right points. We might have even drawn some points over this, put some annotations around it. So we're taking those same graphs, but we're just putting them onto different pages almost, just for kind of bookmark purposes. And they don't have to be different pages, obviously. They could just be show and tell, show and hide sets of visuals for it instead. And then we've got that story kind of going through to say kind of why things are happening or what the data is telling you. So this is the kind of distilled message version. This is your real children's storybook version that you kind of would typically do in PowerPoint. Last example I wanted to show was around baby names. So this is one of the examples that Mark Wilcock has put together or got from the Office of National Statistics, which very, very simple data set. Shows for each year all the different names for boys and for girls, what their rank was in each year. So it's literally just that. It's just very, very simple data set. You've got that for boys for each year and for girls in each year. And we've got the ranking there because just to kind of put it in the right order, because actually a rank of 1 is very good, and we want to potentially show that as the highest. So here 1 will be the highest, and that we can sort it by. So we can pick out, again, we can do a bit of exploratory analysis. We can pick out a few boys' names and girls' names and kind of see the trend in those and kind of see which ones are popular. But what it really comes down to is what we want to see is what that storytelling is for that. And again, what we need to really be able to do is pick out an audience for this. So, there are lots of people who could potentially be interested in baby names, potential parents or parents looking to name their baby, sociologists, anthropologists. So I picked an audience that would be interested in this from a commercial perspective. So again, it's all hypothetical. I'm not doing any work on baby names for clients, but I picked the example of looking at a company which manufactures personalized goods, baby goods. So with names on it, and they obviously need to keep up with trends because the goods that they have stocked in store need to represent the popularity of those names in the wider society. So we picked those. They're really interested in how the popularity of those names have changed, and we can see the examples of these, and we can see the questions. They want to know what names are most popular and which ones are gaining, losing in rank. So it's these ones, which they really are probably interested in as well, because they want to know which ones to start creating goods for. If there's names that are starting to become more popular, like Archie, for example, they want to be able to get ahead of that curve and start building names. They want to understand what impact that has on sales as well. And that's kind of really where we get to the so what. So if we look at then the example of kind of where we ended up with that. So again, it was a kind of hypothetical storyboarding example, but putting that together and looking at the wireframes as to where that might go. But here we split the page into kind of 2. So we're showing for any 2 particular periods. And again, this is an exploratory journey. So we allow people to be able to kind of change exactly what those data points are, exactly what that story is. But what we're showing is the difference between the top names in 2001 or the first date that you selected and the last date that you selected. So it goes up to 2017. And what we can see here, the story that we're getting across here is that actually the names that were most popular at the start of the period, are they still the most popular names now? Or actually what have been the growth, the trend in those names over time? So we can see that all the names that were the most popular in 1984 have all since declined. So those names are now, not really very popular. I don't think any of them have really made it onto the top 5 list in 2017. And that story, you can also see the other side of that. All the names that are popular, the most popular in 2017, have all come from kind of humble beginnings, a couple of decades ago. So this is really giving us that view of kind of being able to compare 2 points in time and see any 2 points in time and see how those popularities have changed. We're also particularly interested, in names that have declined or names that are growing in popularity. So that's a particular measure that we've wanted to bring out here and show those names with the highest decline and show those names with the highest growth. And the story it tells, again, is quite similar. Those names that have had decline in the last 15 years, and again, it's something you can change, those are the names that are now least popular and were most popular, and then the ones with the highest growth are the ones now that are popular. So those are the ones that come there, and we've got the kind of slope graphs there to be able to show that kind of movement of those names. So again, it's between the start point and the end point, where we're not so interested in year by year, but actually where did we start, where did we end? And actually when we hover over these, we've got those tooltips to be able to provide that additional context. So for 2012 and 2017 for each of those. Also got some other things here, again, around kind of being able to provide that exploratory detail, but also provide it in a way that tells a story with compare particular sets of names. So we've got here now we're interested in particular data points. So tables are quite a good way of showing it, but we've got that color coding to be able to show red, amber, green for those popularity of names. So these might be the names that we're currently producing for, and we want to see how the popularity of those names specifically has changed, not necessarily those that were the top 5 or the bottom 5, but actually a particular set of names that we choose. As I said, what was really important with this also was to get across this idea of so what and of that context. So it was really about actually, is the popularity of names important? What impact is that going to have if we're producing personalized baby name goods for names that are not popular? And so I made up some sales data to go with this. And obviously, this is all completely hypothetical, and it probably does show a pattern, obviously, because I created it. But it really shows that actually these names that we're producing for at the moment, or I'd assume that we're producing for, have all been declining in popularity by sales. So those particular products have been declining in sales, and then we've got that correlation for those names between the rank in each year and the total sales, or the current ranks and the total sales. So so each year then is plotted as a separate point. So this really then tells the kind of story around the so what. It provides that analysis. And again, once we've really got to that story, we can then take that into the children's storybook version. And we can say, actually, let's start with our sales rank analysis. So, we've got this kind of narrative here where we say these are the top names, have also been the ones with the highest growth, and these are the ones we should focus on. So we have those recommendations, we have things that we can really provide as part of that children's storybook to be able to present back to the exec audience. So, conscious of time, hopefully those demos have given you a bit of an idea as to how this can be applied in practice. These are some of the resources. Obviously, this deck will be made available. Make sure I'll put a link to it. And if there's any questions, obviously on the virtual environment, this is slightly harder, but obviously post on YouTube in comments or reach out to me in social media. Happy to have a conversation about this or talk about how I've tried to apply storytelling, and it's something I'm on a journey with myself. And I hope you enjoyed that and got something useful out of it. And I look forward to continuing the dialogue with you on or offline. Thank you very much.